Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're joining us from. So my name is Johanna Siljakus. I work with the Transport Sector Office at the Asian Development Bank, and I would like to warmly welcome you to today's webinar with the e-mobility platform. Today, we're going to be talking about propelling national zero-emission vehicle adoption through public-private collaboration. And this webinar is co-arranged together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Today, we'll be hearing highly interesting presentations by our esteemed speakers representing the private sector. So we'll hear sharing experiences about their work in the field of transport electrification. The experiences presented today will be focused on India, but I hope that the lessons learned can be extracted from them also to other countries in the region, and we can discuss that further during the session as well. We aim to provide space for an exchange of experiences between all participants today, and we'll have here I'm seeing from the participants, we'll have here financiers, we'll have governments, we'll have academia, NGOs, apart from the private sector. So a nice mix of participants, and thus we hope and look forward to your active participation today. But before moving or diving more deeply into the subject matter of the session, there are a couple of remarks I'd like to make. So first of all, this webinar is arranged under the umbrella of the e-mobility support and investment platform for Asia and the Pacific. That's a knowledge platform that aims to build capacity and support the scale-up of financing of e-mobility initiatives. The platform is operated by ADB. It's co-financed by the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, and supported by UNEP. And if you would like to join the platform's e-mobility community, in order to stay up to date on the platform's activities, you can fill in this assessment survey. At the end of the survey, you can leave us your contact details and you'll be included in our mailing list. You'll see the QR code now on the screen, and we'll also share the link in the chat in a bit later as well. And just a bit on our next webinar. So that's arranged as part of, or we have webinars every 2 weeks as part of this platform. Our next one will be on the 20th of November. That's with GIZ Philippines and the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, discussing pathways for a just transition when it comes to electrification of public transport in the Philippines. And you can see the QR code again on the screen. We'll share the link to the registration in the chat after a bit. And then finally, before diving into the topic of the day, I want to remind a couple of things on house rules. So to ensure a smooth webinar session, all microphones will be disabled as per default. There will be a Q&A session after our presentations today. So we ask you to pose your questions through the Q&A function, which is a button available at the bottom of your screens. Those questions will be screened and passed over to our speakers during the Q&A session. You can use the chat function as well. I hope that should be available for everyone. And there, just feel free to more kind of informally chat through that function. You can introduce yourself, you can post any comments and experiences there as well. And finally, so please note that the session is recorded and we aim to post it online later on. But now let me hand over to Esther Perrin, who's an associate at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She will be moderating today's session. Over to you, Esther. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Johanna, and thanks everyone for your participation this morning. So as mentioned, I'm from the Transport and Mobility team within the Industrial Transformation Pathway at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and I'll be running you through our program today. I'll kick off with just a few words of introduction on WBCSD and bring in my colleague Gunay Husseina-Lizadeh, to say a little bit more about what our work has been in terms of collaborative models between public and private sector on adoption of zero-emission vehicles and specifically on India. We'll then head over to the main piece of our discussion today, which is going to be a roundtable between three great speakers from the corporate sectors representing various angles and points of view from the industry on this large transition, to also share some bits and pieces of experiences that they had in India with accelerating the ZET transition. And we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, which will be kicked off by Japneet Kaur from the Asian Development Bank. And then we'll kick off with, end the webinar with a few words of reflection and conclusion. Next slide, please. Just as an introduction for someone who might not know, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, is a global community of businesses which drives collective action and knowledge sharing to drive systems transformation for a better world in which 9+ billion people can live well within planetary boundaries by 2050. Next slide, please. Within the transport and mobility value chain, we've been really focused on the challenge of scaling up electrification and low carbon solutions, and looking more specifically at how we can accelerate the global adoption and mainstream the adoption of zero emission vehicles. The way we're doing this is primarily through acceleration of adoption of ZEVs in regional or national markets, and we'll run you through this approach a little bit more. And we also look at actions where we can better integrate elements of nature positive and just transition into the deployment of ZEVs. Next slide, please. Now, just a little bit of context on our approach. What does a country need when it starts from scratch or close to scratch on shaping a market for adoption of ZEVs? An essential element is the mobilization. Do we have political ambition locally? Do we have an industry that is ready to mobilize and that has the knowledge and has the vision for the ZEV transition? Are there the right policy and technology adoption roadmaps in place? And finally, do we have the right financing mechanisms? And this is essentially where WBCSD, with its community of businesses, has decided to take a look in the past few years. What we do essentially is a mobilization of public and private sector leaders around a country coalition. We create associated governance in which they have the capacity to exchange on policy or technology adoption priorities. Where do we need to intervene to create the right market conditions to facilitate the adoption of zero emission vehicles? We also run our partners through aggregation exercise of actionable demand for zero emission vehicles. That helps us identify not only the ambition level, but also the supply constraints and market gaps, and substantiates the actual demand towards supply and financiers. We're active in 3 markets right now. India is our most advanced, where we've run through a demand aggregation exercise and are now looking into associated financing models and specific partnerships on charging infrastructure, and you'll hear a lot more about it today. But we're also launching new dialogues in Mexico and Brazil. And I would now like, for the next slide, to hand over to my colleague Gunay to tell us a little bit more about what we've been doing.
Thank you, Esther, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. As Esther mentioned, so I'll be just building up on that. Our collaboration, which initially started in India, has resulted in a few collaboration models emerging as a result of those partnerships. And the key models, they can be replicated across different geographies. We are currently deploying them in Latin America as well, and have an ambition to expand to other geographies in the global south. The first of them is demand aggregation. This is where we collect individual demand and we aggregate it for market creation. This sends a strong signal to the whole ecosystem, including the governments, the policymakers, and financiers, OEMs, and also is helping with the economies of scale. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, but for now, I want to bring up the second model, which is using data and digital solutions for charging infrastructure planning. This helps to optimize the fleet OpEx for companies, but at the same time, it also helps to the governments in better planning and optimizing the planning of infrastructure investments. We announced the task force in last year at COP28, which is currently working on the establishing a data sharing platform, which will facilitate this data sharing among stakeholders for better planning of the infrastructure and the associated investments. Is creating bankable projects and how we do that is by channeling the public and private finance to design innovative financing mechanisms to de-risk and scale up the existing ZEP deployment investments. If you go to the next slide, it contains a little bit of more information and breakdown of the demand aggregation exercise that we ran in India. So this demand signal was announced at the G20 and the Clean Energy Ministerial events in Goa last year, where 15 companies announced the demand signal for around 8,000 trucks. You see on the screen the breakdown of this, which represents around 12% of LDV and 44% of the medium duty vehicles, and almost the same amount for the heavy duty vehicles. But of course, since July last year, we have expanding the signal. We have included 5 more companies who have come up with 2,500 and more truck pilots that they are running. And today you will have an opportunity to hear both about the truck pilots that are happening and also the infrastructure planning. The proof of concept that we've been doing was one of our partners, and also we will hear a perspective from the financiers on how to make these projects more bankable and attractive for investors. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it back over to Esther.
So much, now we're going to kick off a roundtable, and I think when we had the invitation from ADB to participate in this webinar, I think our work in India became quite an obvious example of what we could bring to the table for this discussion. And I think better than hearing it from us, it's better to ask the companies who have been participating about the various perspectives that they can bring. And so the following roundtable is our attempt at doing so and creating this space for conversation. We'll have 3 interventions by 3 different speakers, all providing different perspectives. We have a technology and IT services provider, we have a fleet operator, and we have a representative from the finance sector. So all very different angles of this transition and different building blocks of this transition. And so I very much look forward to hearing what they have to say. And we'll have, as I mentioned, quite lots of time for Q&A in the second half of this hour. To kick us off, so please, next slide. And, Dr. Makiko Hisatomi, who's the Senior Director of Fujitsu Research of Europe, which is the research brand of the global ICT equipment and services company, Fujitsu. We know that deploying charging infrastructure is still the primary challenge of transport electrification. It requires enormous investments and infrastructure planning. And Hisatomi-san will tell us about a pilot led by Fujitsu in India to leverage collective insights from the companies participating in this coalition, specifically to optimize the deployment of charging infrastructure in the country. Over to you, Hisatomi-san. And thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Makiko Hisatomi. I'm a Senior Director from Fujitsu Research of Europe based in the UK. Thank you very much for inviting us here today to talk about the work which Fujitsu is conducting with WBCD in India to demonstrate the value of digital collaboration as part of the Zero Emission Vehicle Emerging Market Initiative, ZEV-EMI. As Esther and Gunay mentioned, ZEV-EMI is an initiative WBCT and US government and UK government are leading to elevate cooperation between governments and businesses in emergent economies to accelerate the transition to zero-emission vehicles. Next slide, please. India's freight sector is growing from 3 trillion ton-kilometer today to 10 trillion ton-kilometer by 2050. So although trucks make up only less than 3% of the India's vehicles, it consumes 30% of the diesels and also contributing to the 30% of the road transport emission. So it is important to accelerate the decarbonization of the trucks. So how can we actually accelerate decarbonization of the trucks? There are many ways to do this. As a technology company, we focus on the role of the data in EV infrastructure for this pilot project. For truck electrification, charging infrastructure remains the prime challenge. So given the capacity intensity of the fast charging infrastructure for e-trucks, it is crucial that the chargers are installed in locations with high demand and utilization. However, there are several challenges which hinder the charging infrastructure planning, such as uncertain demand and operational complexity. Here, data plays the key roles in identifying the optimal charging locations and efficient operations to maximize the investment made for the charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. So in India, as Esther mentioned, so public and private stakeholders are increasingly recognize e-trucks as a promising solutions. So initiatives such as WBCT's Zero Emission Vehicles Emerging Market Initiative and NITI Aayog's eFast India are gathering stakeholders across the value chain to work towards large-scale freight electrification. These efforts have already resulted in demand signals of 5,000 e-trucks by 2027 and 7,700 e-trucks by 2030. Next slide, please. So ZEV-EMI announced national level data sharing platform at COP28 with the aim to gather stakeholders across the value chains to share data on their current and planned e-truck fleets for enabling the assessment of infrastructure needs and informing infrastructure deployment. As one of the first steps, WBCT and Fujitsu carried out a pilot study in collaboration with Gentali to demonstrate the value of data sharing. We used our EV Shift offering and social digital technology to identify optimal charging locations to underpin Gentali's fleet operation in New Delhi and Mumbai. Next slide, please. So by simulating different scenarios, we identified 48 optimal charging locations and demonstrated that optimizing EV charging infrastructure planning can result in 13% reduction in fuel cost, 70% reduction in charging time, 5% increase in fleet operating time, and 60% reduction in CO2 emissions. These have benefits for various stakeholders. For example, for government, it helps better city planning, reducing CO2 emissions, and meeting sustainability goals. For the utility companies, more efficient grid management and avoiding overloads during the peak time. For the fleet operators, minimizing the costly delay and also overinvestment for the charging infrastructure, and also for drivers, seamless charging experience, and also reducing charging anxiety. Next slide, please. So we demonstrated that by digital collaboration, optimizing EV charging infrastructure planning can result in 13% reduction in fuel cost and 70% reduction in charging time. So our recommendation from this learning to the next step is we should maximize fleet data collection to inform better operational decision-making and infrastructure planning. We should aggregate those data from fleet operators to identify and prioritize locations and streamline the permitting process. And also we should design for the scalability to ensure the infrastructure can expand with the EV demand and adding chargers and increasing the capacity. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, and again for this. Now over to our next intervention, looking at collaboration between companies and the public sector, as we've covered, can really create the right market conditions to facilitate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles by companies. We can go to the next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. Mr. Aditya Rai is the Senior Program Manager at Amazon India's Operations Sustainability Team. And he will tell us about the efforts of the company in scaling up the decarbonization of their trucks and of their fleets in India, as well as specific findings from a pilot activity they've been running over the past year. Over to you, Aditya. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Esther, for that great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Being cautious of the time, I'll just take a few minutes, and I look forward to a lot of questions in the Q&A to go into more details. A quick introduction to what we do here at Amazon India. We have a small sustainability team that is tracking our carbon emissions and forecasting a glide path to net zero carbon by 2040, which is approximately 30 years before what the government estimates India can reach net zero carbon. So that puts us in the hot seat to being always ahead of the time, adopting technologies that others might still be doubting. And we have made a lot of bold decisions and big strides towards this goal. The first of which, relevant to this discussion, was when Jeff visited India in 2020. We took a bold decision to announce a public goal of deploying 10,000 electric vehicles in India by 2025. So that was a 5-year horizon for getting as many EVs as possible. It was not an easy task. Nobody forecasted the pandemic back then, but through these last 5 years, we've tried everything, and we've made sure that we stay on course for this first of many goals that we took for India. There are goals in other spaces, including renewable energy and buildings, but for this discussion, we'll stick to EVs as much as possible. So the bold vision for 2020, bold vision in 2020 for 2025, the 10,000 EVs, that is something we are on track, and we should hear more about it soon. Now, within this distribution of vehicles, we've got about 70% of our fleet catering to the last mile delivery segment, which is the vehicle that comes to your home to deliver your Amazon packages to you. These vehicles are generally small, 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, small trucks, and we've seen great adoption in India. But it hasn't been without its challenges. The major challenges being, how do you cater to the owner-operator? Owner-operators are the biggest chunk of our gig economy all across the world. But with interest rates on EVs being in the range of 10 to 15% compared to relatively lower 8 to 9% for used vehicles, it's been hard for us to get first-time buyers to buy electric vehicles unless they have a good credit rating. On this path, like I said, 70% is last mile delivery, but 2025 is just a few months away. So we've taken the next big steps towards 2030. Where do we see ourselves in 2030? And WBCSD had been a part of the demand aggregation practice, and we forecast a lot of electric trucks in India. This is something that we're looking at the highway operations. There again, we are faced with the same questions, same challenges that we saw in 2020. In 2020, the basic question was, where is the charging infra? Who is going to lend us money for the vehicles? Why should I dispose of perfectly good diesel and CNG vehicles? We are again getting the same questions from the truck operators. Both of these categories are fairly different. Intracity deliveries are run by different companies, intercity by different companies. So intercity truckers are again reluctant to invest in electric assets. But it's quite clear from all assessments and all scientific ways of assessing this that electric trucks will eventually be cheaper to operate than the diesel trucks. It's only a question about who is willing to take the risk. So for 2030, we've taken a bold goal for getting a lot of electric highway trucks, electrifying a lot of our intercity operations. And our key challenges, I'll just take 10 seconds for the key challenges. The primary one being the cost of capital. In India, the cost of capital or the cost of borrowing money for these assets can go as high as 15%. That is much, it's almost double the margin that a transporter can make by running trucks as a business. And then the secondary challenge had always been the last mile delivery for the associates. These associates are first time earners in their families, do not have the best of address proofs, bankability documents. And then again, how do we lend to them? How do we bring them into the fore? Finally, it comes to the infra. I am quite bullish on infra because we work in the top cities in the most populated regions. I believe it's a virtuous cycle. The more EVs we deploy, the more infra will get created. And when there is enough infra, more EVs will keep coming in. So this is the virtuous cycle we've seen for last mile deliveries. We expect to see this on the highway. I look forward to all the questions from the group. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Aditya. Christina, can I get the next slide, please, to introduce our next speakers? Now to actually, from the challenges of assessing and planning for the deployment of trucks on the roads, Aditya made actually quite a few points that were getting right to the core of what we're going to address next, which is how do we enhance bankability to facilitate the adoption of these trucks? Business and finance models for zero-emission truck pilots in India will be the subject of his intervention. Neeraj Gupta is the managing director of Inetrafin. He's also an experienced business and financial strategist. And let me not further delay this. Neeraj, please take the floor.
Thanks, Esther, and thanks, Aditya, for posing some questions which I was planning to cover in my discourse here. So quick background, I have been working with large global infrastructure funds in the past, and of late, over the last few months, I've been working on setting up a sustainability fund focused on India. And as a part of that, one of the transactions that we're looking at is in EV mobility space. So we've been spending some time there. If we just look at the background of how this sector has evolved in India, government initially came in, gave a lot of impetus, and which actually got the sector going. I think in my view, we have now come to a stage where this business model across the EV space needs to become sustainable on its own and not really rely upon government incentives or government subsidies, which is what the case has been over the last few years. And when we look at that, a few points that I would like to make there are, firstly, the business model, when we talk about energy transition in the EV space, is established because anyway, the vehicles have been moving. It's just that we need to transition those vehicles from ICE to EV. And the key element which comes in there is cost. Cost has a few components. First is the CapEx, second is OpEx, and third is the financing cost. And all three of them are linked to each other. So when we look at CapEx, a few suggestions that I have been making in the past, and these are more relating to the heavy vehicles, which is buses and trucks. Now, the one of the key components there is that today, the battery and the vehicle is being bundled together and sold as one. Now, what that does is that the cost of battery is anywhere between 40 to 60% of the overall vehicle. And when it's coming bundled together with the vehicle, the OEM is actually potentially charging a little extra on the battery, or the buyer is not able to optimize on the cost of battery. Because in most cases, OEMs are not manufacturing the battery themselves, they are buying it elsewhere. So if there could be a case where the regulator in India could look at where the battery could be bought separately and the vehicle could be bought separately, that will potentially bring the cost down. This also becomes important because after, say, 3,000 to 4,000 cycles, battery needs to be replaced. And at that time, if I'm beholden to the OEM again, then obviously my cost would be much higher. So that's one point which will help us in bringing the capex down. Second, and as Aditya brought it up there, the charging infra on highways, the range anxiety there. Now, a couple of people in India are working on battery swapping for trucks. One of the additional things that could be done is if these trucks could be made split into tractor and the trailer, and the homologation which is done could be done in a manner where the tractor and the trailer can be separated. So then if a truck, let's say, have a battery of 300 kV, it can do 200 kilometers. After that, it could simply swap the tractor and trailer continues on its journey. Or if the truck has gone to let's say, a cement plant to deliver the goods, and it has to wait for 3 days to unload, it could simply leave the trailer and the tractor could move on. So those kind of efficiencies or those kind of differences between what is happening today with ICE vehicles and these vehicles could actually bring the cost down, both capex and opex, because the tractor trailer model actually brings the cost opex down, because the tractor makes money when it's moving. It doesn't really make money when it's standing and charging, or if it's waiting to discharge the goods that it's carrying. Similarly, when we look at on the opex front, just to give you a sense of electricity cost in India, renewable electricity cost in India would be about 4 to 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. The grid is supplying electricity at about 8 to 9 rupees. The charging infra is supplying electricity to the people who won't charge anywhere between 10 to 15 to 16, 17 rupees. And the reason for that is that the electricity which they are getting from the grid is expensive, and second, they are amortizing cost of the charger. If the OMCs, oil marketing companies, could roll out chargers, that would actually help in bringing this cost significantly down, because one, their cost of capital is much lower. Secondly, they already have the locations. Thirdly, they have the ability to get all the approvals, which is costly. Today, that's not happening. It's largely being done by private sector. Private sector is largely funding it with equity, which is expensive, and that's the reason the amortization cost of charger itself is high. The second point there is that if Government of India could ensure that any electricity which goes through the chargers will be renewable electricity, because they're anyway getting the feed into their grid, then the electricity cost could itself be brought down from, let's say, if today the component of electricity in overall cost is around 10 rupees, it could be brought down to 5 rupees. So these would help in bringing down the cost significantly. And the third point there is, if government could ensure that the chargers get 24-hour power, you'll be surprised that a lot of these chargers on highways are using DG sets, which is completely counterproductive. And they're using DG sets because they don't have 24-hour power. And DG set power is costing them around 25 rupees as against much lower what it should be. So these few initiatives could bring the cost down. Coming to financing. Now, again, financing for, and Aditya brought that up, financing for electric vehicles is more expensive in India. It is more expensive in India because financiers do not understand the resale value of these vehicles if they were to repossess. Now, if we can separate the battery and let's say the truck or the bus into two different components, then the battery would have a different resale value and the bus would have a different resale value. So few of these initiatives could help. Also, one quick point, I know I'm running out of time, one quick point there. If the financiers could start looking at doing project financing, senior secured loan rather than individual vehicle financing, that will change the risk perception for the financiers. And as the risk comes down, the cost of capital, the cost of financing will come down as well. I guess my time is over.
in you, Ash, for all of these, but there will definitely be more time to discuss these in more detail during the Q&A session. So thank you, and thank you to all three of our speakers now. We're opening up for a Q&A, but first off, if we can go to the next slide, I would like to invite Ms. Japneet Kaur from the Asian Development Bank. She's a senior investment specialist on transports, to give us a few words of wrap-up on what she's heard and kick us off with a question to the panelists. Japneet, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Juana. I would like to thank all the presenters for sharing their experiences and insights. I will be bringing in ADB's perspective on public-private collaboration to this discussion. As the transport demand grows in Asia and the Pacific region, everyone knows there's an urgent need to decarbonize the transportation system. Just putting e-vehicles on the road is not sufficient, as was also highlighted by you, Mr. Gupta. Investments also need to be made to ensure that renewable power is available to charge these at a competitive cost. Efforts need to be made to reduce the upfront costs, as well as consolidate the small-time players, because the transport sector in India is extremely fragmented with the small truckers and small electric bus operators, so that financing is available to them at a cheaper cost. Everyone also knows, and we also agree, that private finance is crucial to cover the future climate finance needs, specifically in this e-mobility sector. We need climate policies, standards, regulations, subsidies, and with private sector engagement integrated to guide expectations and reduce uncertainty. Additionally, the availability of sufficient financing at a reasonable cost is essential for private sector participation, as was also raised by Mr. Rai. ADB and other MDBs support governments through financial instruments, technical assistance, including PPPs. In line with ADB's Strategy 2030, we will expand support for PPPs by assisting in policy advocacy, capacity building, transaction advisory services, and structuring preparation, as well as providing project finance. ADB on the non-sovereign side has been actively supporting e-mobility projects, emphasizing private sector leadership. We have used early stage venture investing through the ADB Ventures Fund and have supported companies in manufacturing light commercial vehicles, developing e-mobility services for logistics, supported e-vehicle fintech companies for providing financing solutions in India. We helped establish battery swapping networks in Bangladesh and supported the manufacturing of e-scooters in Vietnam. These are small investments, but are very crucial for creating a missing ecosystem in the e-mobility sector, which has traditionally been dominated by large automobile companies, which are more in the traditional ICE sector. On the commercial financing side, ADB's non-sovereign projects include manufacturing of e-tuk-tuks, battery and EV manufacturing, deployment of e-buses. These are across geographies, such as Georgia, Vietnam, Thailand, India, and also include some PPP projects in India. Through these efforts, we have gained valuable experience and developed models that we will aim to roll out and replicate across other DMCs. It will be very interesting to hear from the private sector representatives present here. And I have a question which I would like to end with. In your perspective, what is really needed to strengthen the collaboration between companies, governments, and financiers? I'll stop here.
I don't know if one of you wants to go first, maybe Hisatomi-san? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks very much for the great questions. From the digital perspective, in terms of data sharing perspective, one of the important things, as you mentioned about the, using the model, replicable model elsewhere kind of thing, it's very important to have a standard, in a sense, the data standard. So some kind of data framework or minimum data requirement, because sometimes, people are quite reluctant to share the data for various reasons. For example, security, GDPR, these are legitimate reasons. some of the times, what we found from this experience is that, we don't need that detail, granular data. Aggregated data is very much sufficient enough to actually go and do the planning for the EV charging infrastructure. So one of the things that would be quite good is basically the creation of these standards that they can be, rolled out across, various regions. And the other aspect is basically that, more that we can aggregate the data from various stakeholders, the better. We can actually, understand where, the demands are in terms of which road is the right place to put the chargers and so on. So one of the things it would be quite good to have is basically, for the government and, organizations such as WBSD to actually bring the stakeholder, more and more stakeholder into, this value chain ecosystem, so that we can actually, create this kind of national level platform where we can actually, kind of implement accelerate the EV charging infrastructure deployment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Aditya, maybe, do you want to go next?
Not from this question's perspective, but I thought something that we probably didn't highlight in this discussion was a level of commitment. I think that is something everybody, including the banks, including the financiers, are wary of. That today these large corporate houses talk about EVs and electrification. Will they still be as committed to this 3 years down the line? So, what has helped us remain in the leadership for adoption is that if an electric vehicle enters our system, enters Amazon's fleet, we don't let it go unless it's ready to be scrapped. This includes, changing its duty cycle, moving it from a middle mile application to a last mile application, moving it from a night operation to a day operation. I hope my net is still there.
No, we could hear you perfectly. Thank you. And actually, you bring in a very interesting point on this question on collaboration, which is the why of the collaboration. And I think what we've seen in this activity in India and increasingly in the other countries where we're activating similar partnerships is the partnership is necessary to give visibility and to give security to all actors within, that there's commitment around the table. And this is something that's really important to bring up. So thanks for this point. And Neeraj, over to you for the last reaction to this question.
So if you look at the financing landscape in India, we have IREDA, which is a specialized renewable financing institution. We have PFC, REC, which do specialized power and infra financing. What we also need is a specialized EV financing institution in India. The reason being, I mean, we do have small NBFCs, but I don't think they have the bandwidth to actually contribute to the policy framework in India. If we have a large institution, what that could do is bring up the issues that a financier faces in the sector and then help address the policy framework to address those. And this is a point I've been making for a while, and maybe some of the bilateral institutions could come together, set it up, and it'll have to be a large institution, not really small NBFCs, what we have today.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe just following up with you, Neeraj, to continue our Q&A and questions keep coming in. Would you have maybe, how do you envision within this picture the role of national and multilateral development banks in supporting this bankability gap? You talked a lot earlier at taking a hard look at the actual value of the assets and how can we split it up and how can we innovate in terms of the financing models. And in completion of that, how do you see the articulation between the private finance and development finance in this conversation?
So I don't think we need to reinvent the model. The model is existing in India today where ICE vehicles have been financed for the longest of the time and very efficiently. I think what is missing today is that the funding which has been committed by the bilateral institutions is not available, accessible at the right cost. And the reason that's happening is a lot of these institutions, including ADB, have funded some of the NBFCs in India, but those NBFCs are not levered up. So they are largely funding their assets out of equity, which is expensive. So the overall financing cost goes up. And which goes back to what I was mentioning earlier. If some of these institutions could come together, create a large institution, which because of their backing is able to access debt as well, that will bring down the overall cost of capital and thereby provide more efficient financing. Also, once you have a larger institution, your cost of customer acquisition goes down, and that again brings down the overall cost of capital. So that's what I think is needed, because today, while, I mean, for example, ADB has funded one bus manufacturer, they have funded one intercity bus operator, but those are large institutions who have managed to access capital. Smaller guys are not able to. And that can only happen if we have that available through a different vehicle, which is in India and not outside of India.
Yes, thanks very much for that. I think this also echoes some of the comments made by Aditya on how do we handle the impact of this transition on the owner operators, and those are particularly active in India and in actually many countries around the Asia Pacific region. Aditya, do you want to make a comment to that and build on this, or we can also move on to another topic if you prefer?
I think we'll move on to the next topic and questions.
Of course, yes.
Sorry, sir, if you don't mind, if I can just make a point on this owner operator. So I have been working on setting up a platform for bus operations for the last nearly 12 months now. And what I realized was that the sector is transitioning. We will see emergence of large fleet operators in India because the smaller owner operators do not have the capital. When I'm saying capital, is not just the equity which they need to put down. It's also the capital which is required to set up infrastructure which is required. They cannot set up the depots where they can charge their vehicles. They cannot set up chargers on the highways which is required. So which is where more and more what I'm beginning to see there is, and hopefully it'll play out, is that now you will see large bus operating companies emerging. You will see large truck operating companies emerging, which will be entirely electric. And I'm actually in conversation with few of these owner operators who are now looking to get consolidated in such kind of larger fleet operators.
Esther, thank you very much, Neeraj. We have a few questions in the chat from participants. Perhaps we could take some time to answer those.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gunay. Sorry, just taking a minute to read through the last ones that just came in as well, so that we organize our time as best can. Or maybe, Gunay, if there's one in particular that you wanted to answer, I can take the next one.
Yes, I think there is one that what would each of the panelists raise as a key lessons learned from the initiatives in India? So based on your experience in India, I assume what would be a key lesson learned? And it's actually a good platform because we are here covering as the ADB's key focus is on APAC, so it would be good to provide some lessons learned for wider countries in the region on the lessons learned in your experience in India. Who would like to kick off? Neeraj?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
So I think the key lesson which comes out of India is government supported this sector a lot over the last few years. Without that, we would not have been able to be where we are today, and which is important for other governments to learn from as well, that unless government is behind it, the sector is difficult to transition in any such sector.
Thank you. Aditya?
Yeah, I think I second what Neeraj said. The policy framework definitely is important. I think the policy framework in India has not just been towards electrification, it's been towards decarbonization and improving air quality. I see a few questions in the beginning from Syed also. Something went wrong again, but so Syed has also asked the question that we have biogas plants and we want to run electric buses or trucks using biogas gensets. This is the entire ecosystem, electricity makes it very easy for all types of green energy to come in. This is difficult if we try to see or use green hydrogen or any other alternate fuel. So electricity becomes the common currency, right? It becomes the global green currency where we can tap into the renewable resources, including waste to energy and all other associated platforms on that side. What are the lessons that we've learned? We've learned that in India, at least, it's a fragmented ecosystem. You know, your last mile delivery associates are a completely different ballgame compared to your truck operators. Truck operators have traditionally been used to having a highly leveraged balance sheet, making a margin on every rupee that is spent on transportation. But most of that money goes into the fuel cost, right? Cost of operating a 32-feet truck is roughly 32 rupees a kilometer. 20 of that goes into fuel cost. It's only 12 rupees for everything else. On an electric vehicle, it requires a complete change of their business models, and they are reluctant to that change. The policy framework helped us make a good transition in the last mile mobility segment with two-wheelers and three-wheelers. In the middle mile and the trucking space, the recent government announcements have been only an allocation of roughly 500 crore rupees. Does not seem significant compared to the 10,000 crores for last mile mobility. And in the absence of a policy framework, we are fighting through the same questions, same barriers, same challenges that we had in 2020 for last mile. So that has been my takeaway, is that it's a cycle, you know, every 5 years, there's a new industry, there is a new set of stakeholders, but the questions remain the same. And the answer is always, are you willing to take the risk? Because Amazon is committed to helping you out. Maybe in 2030, we'll be asking whether we can decarbonize shipping and air transport. So then again, we'll be having the same questions, you know, is it worth it or not? But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you,
And-
Hisatomi-san. Yeah.
Yeah, from my perspective, basically what we've learned is the power of the aggregation of the data. So as you know, Andrea said, you know, in a sense that, you know, each of the operators, fleet operators are, you know, working hard. And I think, you know, by collecting data, and data are available, that's what also we found that not only in India, but other places as well, data are available. It's just we are not making most out of it to actually have the, you know, comprehensive, you know, understanding of where the charging demands are. And I think by doing that, we can, you know, maximize the investment that the, you know, government and private sectors are already making in any case. So there is this kind of like digital, you know, collaboration, which is, you know, absolutely key from our perspective. Not just the, you know, partner physical collaboration, but also digital collaboration. So that was the important learning from us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hisatomi-san. I have one actually follow-up with you on this. And you've said lots actually about the potential of enhancing digital collaboration. And we've seen quite some interesting results from your pilot results on how this can actually affect materially the cost of operating electric vehicle fleets, the efficiency of vehicle operations on sites, and ultimately the capital expenditure that goes into deploying the infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit more from your experience in India, but looking to other countries in the region, of what are the foundational elements of you know, creating the right environment for digital partnership? Where should governments and companies start when they start thinking at how they can digitally optimize as well this part of the transition?
I think from the company's perspective, I think what we found from our experience is that through collaboration with the partners and customers and so on, we found that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the data is already available. And, you know, a lot of the times, those fleet operators and other companies are quite busy doing their, you know, the main job. And what we found is that, you know, we can use the data in a different way to actually accelerate the sustainability aspect, and also in terms of even the operational, you know, cost reduction aspect as well. So I think, Sorry, I wasn't moving enough in the meeting room. Sorry. So in terms of what we found is, like one of the things private, companies can do is to look into what can be actually, what data is available and how that can be used, kind of thing. And from the government perspective, I think if the government can encourage a little bit more in terms of the data sharing aspect or the standardization activities, I think that would really help a lot in terms of, trying to work this more systematically as a nation or as a region or as a, city. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question, and then I'll offer for a few words of wrap up. And just as a warning to our speakers, I'll invite you to find 2 or 3 words, I think, to wrap up your key findings from the case in India and this conversation to countries that are starting to look into accelerating the adoption of zero-emission vehicles on their market. So that will be my request to you to close this panel. But for one last question, let me turn to Neeraj. Sorry, putting you on the spot for both answers. There's a question that came in through the chat on, apart from technological nascency and the level of maturity of electric vehicles and the fact that we're still not at cost parity in terms of the initial capital investment, what makes financial institutions hesitant to provide widely available financing? What kind of technical support and assistance would be needed to help bridge that gap?
So very simply, when we look at vehicle financing in India, the financial institutions or the lending banks, they rely a lot on the resale value and not so much on the borrower. To give you an example, a lot of times they will finance up to 100% of the value of a truck because they have experience with this borrower, and secondly, they know that there's a particular price at which they can sell this truck after 1 year if there's a default. So that's what it boils down to. And today, where we are, they are not able to pin down a value at which they will be able to resell the truck or the bus, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's an excellent point and very short. I appreciate you. Thank you very much for the answer. Now to wrap up, I think we've heard already quite a lot on what we've learned in India that would be applicable to other countries and on starting or accelerating this journey to decarbonization of transport, and particularly on this challenge of making zero-emission vehicles widely mainstream adoption of this technology. We've heard that it's necessary for partnerships to help establish a clear image of what is the demand for vehicles, the demand, locational-based demand for charging infrastructure, also a clear vision on what will be the priority for technology adoption. Can we pick one lane in terms of transport? And this visibility is crucial for all actors around the table to get their ducks in a row. A clear policy framework, of course, is going to be an essential element of this. We heard from Hisatomi-san about the potential of leveraging digital collaboration to optimize adoption and investments, which provides quite a valuable complementary approach to help also scale down a little bit of the costs associated. And finally, on finance, what I heard from Neeraj, but please, Neeraj, feel free to prove me wrong, is let's not reinvent the wheel in finance, but EV do provide new opportunities to rethink about asset value and financing models. This is my takeaways now, turning over to my speakers for just in 2-3 words, what you would like participants to remember from this conversation.
So from my perspective, 2 words would be digital collaboration. Thank you.
Aditya?
I think I've spoken the most here, but from this takeaway, apart from the financing aspect, I believe on a corporate front and on a user side application, a commitment or an internal commitment from the leadership to have a certain percentage of your fleet to be electric. Because irrespective of all the challenges, in the long run, the electric vehicles are still cheaper. So 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever is the risk appetite. But moving towards that will allow us all to learn, allow us to create that infrastructure, and then help the adoption. And we'll have more to discuss once we reach that level. WBCSD and RMI, everybody's been helping us in getting to a space where in 2030 we'll have sufficient number of trucks operating across the country, and we'll come back to you with all those learnings and then the new discussions around them.
Thank you. So I hear partnership and I hear commitment. Yuraj?
I think one thing which will really help is this sector is evolving. So if all of us keep having similar seminars where we're exchanging ideas and learning from each other, that's going to help. Another thing which I think will also help, which is not there today, is some research reports coming out from consultants and bankers, because this sector is not covered. Those kind of research reports actually help the corporates and the lenders a lot, and the investors as well.
The knowledge and learning it is. Thank you so much, Neeraj, for those closing words. And to the three of our panelists, thank you very, very much for showing up today and give your insights in this conversation. I would also like to really thank our hosts at ADB for providing this platform today. And on this, just a few words of closing. We're continuing the work in India on building the financing capacity for putting the trucks that have been announced on the road. We're looking at improving and deepening the work on the charging infrastructure, digital collaboration platform. As I mentioned, new discussions emerging in India, in Brazil and Mexico, and you'll hear more about it, I hope. We're always interested to hear back from anyone around the community. If particularly you find that there is in your country potential to look at these types of partnerships and a specific need to address a particular policy hurdle, we're always happy to provide have a discussion. I think the last slides included our contact information, but you can also reach out directly to the ADB hosts of this webinar, and I'm happy to take any requests for questions after this webinar. Sorry, we're a bit over time, but handing over to Johanna for the closing words.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for our participants, for the active asking of questions and sending through questions and comments. And a very, very special thank you to our speakers, Hisatomi-san, Mr. Rai, Mr. Gupta. Thank you for your insightful presentations. That was really interesting, and all of those reflections that you made. Thanks also, Japnit, for your comments, and for WBS-CSD for hosting this session. I think it was highly interesting and really useful for all of our participants. So yes, let's stay connected. We'll share the recording with all registered participants as soon as possible, and we hope to see you in our upcoming webinar, which is on the 20th of November on just transition in the Philippines by GIZ Philippines and ICSC at the same time in Zoom as well. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of the day, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.